Welcome to Fire University. This is a podcast dedicated to fire ecology and management within the Natural Resource University Podcast Network. My name is Dr. Marcus Lashley. I'm a wildlife biologist, an assistant professor of disturbance ecology at the University of Florida, and a lifelong hunter that's passionate about wildlife conservation and management. In this podcast, I will interview scientists and professionals not only on the latest research in fire ecology, but also about their experiences, in hopes that you as the listeners can learn why fire ecology is important and also how you can use it to meet your natural resource management goals. So let's get to the burning questions in Fire University. Hey everybody, welcome back to Fire University. Today, this is a topic that has been asked about quite frequently from many of you in the audience. I brought two experts in this topic area today, Dr. Craig Harper and Dr. Bronson Strickland, to talk about what can you do when you don't have access or cannot burn for some reason or another, but you're still interested in improving habitat, namely for deer and turkey. That's what we get asked about quite a bit. So Craig, Bronson, thanks for coming. Really excited about the topic today.
Glad to be here, Marcus. I'm a little confused, though. You said experts and then followed up with Craig Harper.
Well, he did say when you can't use fire. So there you go, Bronson. There's your cue in right there.
Yeah, I also said that I was really excited and we're going to not be talking about fire. So it's maybe some inaccuracies in that opening.
You're going to struggle through this one, evidently. Yeah, since fire won't be a topic.
I'm just going to sit back.
Hence him getting two of us to help him.
But you're right, Marcus, that this is a topic we get all the time. We certainly stress the importance of fire. And but there's so many people, especially in my neck of the woods, that lease land, whether it be from a timber company or whoever. And that's just not an option on the table for them. So, yeah, I think this will be a good discussion for those people.
Yeah, I agree. Before the show, we were talking about the reasons that people don't or can't burn differ, some depending on where you're from. But here in the Pine Belt, you're certainly right. Large amount of the acreage is owned by a timber company or something that's being leased to hunt. And that's certainly an important consideration when you're thinking about managing habitat and what you have access to and what you don't. So it's a good point.
It's a good thing that we're talking about, oh gosh, what do you do when you can't burn? You know, intuitively that says, wow, a lot more people are burning today. And we consider that very highly, when alternatively you could say, well, if you can't burn, I guess you do what everybody else does north of Tennessee, because north of Tennessee, by and large, there's not that many people burning as there are below the Mid-South area. That has a lot to do with the states, the regulations that are in place, and of course the culture. So the Deep South, for sure, with pine-dominated systems, have a much stronger culture in use of fire than when you get north of there. And so, of course, there's a whole bevy of things that can be done when you can't use fire. But I think it's good that we're getting these questions. Well, what if I can't burn? Highlighting how many people now are beginning to burn more than they did just a few years ago.
Yeah, I agree. And also tells you people understand or realize that fire is probably something that they want to be able to do, but for some reason or another, it's not accessible. So even that is telling us that people are starting to value how important fire can be in your habitat management program. So, well, I don't want to go too much further without just going on and getting into it. So what if you're in a situation, let's start with the situation that's so common in the Deep South, in the Pine Belt. If you're, not a landowner and you're leasing land, but you're still interested in making habitat improvements, for most of those people who are leasing, I guess, for deer and turkey, what are some things, some options that those people do have?
Well, I guess, Marcus, where I typically start with people is let's check some boxes first before we get into maybe the limited range of things they can do, quote, habitat wise. Let's start with some real basic stuff that applies across the board to everybody. First of all, let's look at what is your deer density. That is something, obviously, if you're leasing land, you're harvesting deer. So that is something you can control and manipulate. And that's going to start with data collection. So you're going to have to collect harvest data, looking at carcass condition, body weight, comparing that to your neighbor, to your region, et cetera, getting expert opinion from biologists in your area. Are you above average, below average? Do you think you have a density problem? So that's always going to be an issue, whether you can include fire or not. The other thing that is a very common practice, even if you lease land, timber company or otherwise, is most people give you some area. It may not be enough, but they give you some area for food plots. And so I try to work with people in getting a soil test, all the stuff we teach and talk about, managing a productive cool season food plot first, and then move into, if you can, warm season food plots, which is often neglected by a lot of people during the summer. Are they growing high quality forages at that time?
Mm-hmm.
That is typically where I start with a lot of people. Then if we can, what are the constraints they have about habitat? Can they do anything at all? Well, it might be things like daylighting roads, incorporating, rather than an old field or opening, now let's incorporate a disc. And let's make sure we cultivate, naturally occurring forages and get those in the system. That is typically where I start with most people, Marcus, in my neck of the woods here in the Deep South.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think those are good points. And I'm curious, Bronson, and your experience when you're working with these people, typically how much of their lease is in openings where they have the option to do those things?
Probably less than 2%, maybe 1%.
Yeah, so that's
Not
very
enough
much.
from my perspective. I don't own the land, but just from a deer management perspective and providing food, not enough. So that's going to be a limitation. Hence, one of the reasons why collect harvest data, look at your carcass condition, and get your density managed according to the carrying capacity of the property.
Mm-hmm. I think it might be interesting to contrast that with what if you're not focused on deer and you were instead interested or also interested in turkeys? How does that change things?
I guess for me, even though I obviously don't get that question as much as you guys do, it's probably going to be more of, let's say, if they were turkey centric and not deer centric, it might be less on the openings that you have for food plots and just disking and managing succession in that format. So just try to maximize those openings as much as you can. And Marcus, this is something that's probably really boring for people to hear, but it's so true, is you really, whether it be turkey or deer or whatever, every site's going to be different. And you really have to get back to the whole, what are the limiting factors for that property? And also thinking about getting on Google Earth or whatever and looking at your neighbors at a much bigger scale, especially if you're a sub 1,000-acre property. What is the landscape like? What is limiting around you? And then what are the things you can do to augment at a bigger scale the habitat in your area? So I know we always say limiting factors and plug in the lowest hole in the bucket and so forth, but we always say it because it's so important. It's true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really good points. So I guess if we're going to contrast that to some of the properties you or the people that you often work with, Craig, how does that change in terms of what you're thinking about when you're working with someone who maybe they do own their land, but they have other limitations that's keeping them from using fire?
Well, it's a different world. below here, and I'm talking about below Tennessee, and you get into the areas that are predominantly pine forested, and you have these large land holdings that lease acreage, as Bronson was referring to, the leaseholders really are restricted in what they're allowed to do. But when you get above that, and you're not talking about leaseholders of pine lands where you're hamstrung as to what you can do, your options are really open. And so you have much more open ground. The landscape may, well, obviously it's the same as areas, it may be, in as areas where you can use fire. I mean, you can use fire in Pennsylvania, you can use fire in Virginia or Indiana or Michigan, wherever. And so you're talking about restrictions in what perhaps there may be state or regional ordinances. People might just not feel comfortable in using fire. In my opinion, that's the number one thing that prevents most people from using fire. They aren't comfortable with it. And so, and that's fine. There should be some apprehension and a bit of fear, whether it be for using fire or climbing on a tractor. And so that's something that I talk to people about when they haven't used fire, or are apprehensive to do so. But okay, that's fine. Let's get past that and say, okay, what can you do other than burning? Well, what is fire? It's a disturbance technique. And so there's lots of other disturbance techniques that a landowner can use to improve their property for deer or turkeys, or whatever the case may be. Of course, there are advantages to fire, but you still have mechanical disturbances, whether that's with a tractor and a disc, or a bush hog, or of course, chemical disturbance. That's one that we use as much or more than anything in accompaniment with fire is herbicides. So there's lots of things that can be done. Of course, in forested settings, chainsaws are always used. And so when we manage, for example, a forested area with fire, we're doing so with cutting or killing trees. And so if you can't use fire, then you're just having to go back in more frequently to kill or cut additional stems, whereas we can use fire to kill those much more efficiently. And so if someone can't use fire, they're simply using a chainsaw, more frequently than they would otherwise. And then in field settings, instead of burning, you might, of course, disc. A lot of times, according to the structure of the field, you might need to mow or spray the field prior to disking, according to how much biomass is on the field. So there you have mechanical disturbance along with chemical disturbance that you're using in conjunction that is very effective. And so where we might go into an old field setting and do a lot of spot spraying in June or July, and then come back 3 to 4 weeks later and burn those dead spots, you can do the same thing with a disc. And you can wait until late winter just prior to spring green up. It's very easy then to disc that material, as opposed to earlier in the fall that you would not want to because of the cover that is remaining in the field over winter time. And of course, it is not typically a good situation to go into spring or early summer and be disking, especially on the scale that you might be disking because of nesting and brooding and fawning and that kind of thing. But we're just talking about transitioning our types of disturbance from fire to other things. And when you're outside of the restrictions of leased land, then essentially you can do, hopefully anything else.
Yeah. Very interesting. So you talked about some, there are advantages to fire, and there's certainly advantages to some of those other things. Are there things, let's say, in the forest setting that you were describing with some of those forest stand improvement practices, using the chainsaw versus using the chainsaw with fire? What are you losing I guess, when you take fire out of it, aside from logistically, like you talked about being, having to go back in more frequently. So are there other things that you're losing in that setting?
Yes, with regard to deer or turkeys, you're losing forbs. And so with a chainsaw, you're creating or enabling additional sunlight to come into the stand. But if you're not consuming that leaf litter with fire and enabling the seed bank to germinate, then what you're left with is predominantly woody sprouting. And, that's not bad, but overall, that's not as good as if you can have that strong forb component, which overall has increased nutrition for deer, also has better brooding structure for turkeys, has better seed producing plants. Many forb species produce a lot of seed that various birds eat, and also are very important with regard to supporting insects. So insects are strongly tied to many forb species. And so you're talking about both food and cover resources for these animals at different times of the year. And so that's, another reason why fire is very important and can be a real added benefit when you're managing some of these areas. And you don't get that when you can't use fire. Unless you literally go in and scratch the ground after you've cut the trees. And then with that soil disturbance, of course, you're going to, according to how much sunlight you have, you're going to have a flush of forbs, but not without that.
Okay. So in that same scenario, if you start using herbicides to control some of the woody resprouting, are you still going to be limited by forbs? I mean, what kind of plant community would develop if you were using cutting in tandem with herbicide?
You may, according to the leaf litter and how much is there, but that leaf litter is what's suppressing the germination of the seed bank. And that's where the fire is so valuable. Similar to a field situation, if you have a field that is covered in thatch, then you're probably going to perpetuate perennial grasses. And it's not until you disc the soil that you get a strong forb response. Similar, well, if you have strong perennial grasses and you burn, then you're probably going to maintain a lot of perennial grass cover. Your timing of burning might influence that. But even when you're able to use fire in field situations, the addition of herbicides and or soil disturbance through disking can be very important in terms of changing that plant community into something that's more favorable.
So in that field setting, if you don't have access to fire, don't use fire, are you losing anything by only using disking and herbicides that you would have gained by having fire involved?
Well, you're going to probably have a little more time on your hands with regard to woody encroachment, and a certain amount of woody encroachment is good, whether that's for a variety of non-game songbirds or shade for turkeys loafing in a field during the summertime, deer bedding sites within an old field, the variable structure that brings about that makes it very attractive for brooding. And so all of that comes together. You can keep that knocked back with fire on a certain fire regime. Whereas when you allow that to develop without using fire, that can be difficult to get a disc over. And so that means you're having to go in and do a little more grunt work, if you will, with the chainsaw or spot spraying some of those woody sprouts. So, you're manipulating it in different ways, and you still can get a very good forb response without fire in fields if you're spraying, and in particular, using spot spraying to kill problematic or undesirable species. And in those dead spots, once that thatch begins to decompose, then you're going to have a flush from the seed bank. But fire, of course, is more efficient and helps that along.
Okay.
Hey, Craig, this is not not meaning to be a gotcha question here.
Go for it. Everybody else does.
Well, I guess I didn't mean gotcha. I know you don't have data in front of you, so I'm going to ask you to kind of think back. Do you have a lot of situations where you've worked with properties that did just what you're talking about in terms of they never incorporated fire, but utilized the techniques you're talking about and got a favorable response and were satisfied with changes in deer and or turkey or both years down the road?
Oh, absolutely. Many. One of the best examples I can think of right off the top of my head is working with some folks in the mountains of North Carolina. And because of their timber interest, and because they just didn't really like the idea of using fire that much, they used old field management with herbicides and disking, a lot of timber management, but it was primarily silvicultural harvest, as well as a fair amount of forest stand improvement and a lot of food plots. And they went from, the ubiquitous quote scrub buck in about 2006 until about 2000, I think it was 2012 or so, killed the first 170 class buck. So, I mean, absolutely, you can do that without fire. It's just that fire makes it easier, and fire gives you more options to get to where you want to go. And fire can make things better than it would without it.
I was hoping you would say that, Craig, just so people could hear that there are some great examples. If
Right.
you are not able to use it, they still were able to accomplish their objectives.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And along those same lines, I'm thinking through, particularly in the forested setting, when you're talking about losing forbs, and if you don't use fire, does that make it more important to have a strong food plot program where you're going to be using forbs to some degree in that program?
The food plots certainly help, but you don't have to have it as long as you have enough open land and you're managing the early successional vegetation appropriately. And that's really strongly advocating forbs in those areas and not grasses. Deer don't eat grass unless they're about to starve, or it's wheat or oats, or grass in March and April when it's just popping out. Relatively speaking, very low with regard to nutritional value. And you get an area it's all thick, full of grass, the quality for broods goes way down. The clutter at ground level is such that broods can't hardly get around in it. Even other species, bobwhite or whatever the case may be, you get this clutter that's at ground level, and the mobility is down, the food value is low, the cover is strongly reduced, and all of a sudden those animals are using around the edge of the field. And of course, if you read game management, Leopold called them edge species, but that's because of the landscape, the agricultural landscape that he was working in, not because those animals needed an edge. I think you could easily, and I certainly have, make the argument that there actually is no such thing as an edge species. What that means is those species have a certain structural requirement. And if you are not managing a field appropriately, such that the turkey broods or the bobwhite or the rabbits or whatever the case may be is not as prevalent in the middle of the field as along the edge of the field, then that just means you're not managing the field appropriately for that species.
So in your experience, when you're not managing the field well, is that because of a particular problem, or does it vary widely across landowners? What are you?
Well, yeah, I mean, it could be for any number of reasons. For example, how are you going to manage the structure in a soybean field? You can't. How are you going to manage the structure in a hay field? So no, I'm not talking about production agriculture. I'm talking about, okay, I people who have made the decision that they're going to manage their fields by mowing. It's going to get away from us if we don't get that mowed down, whatever the case may be. And so, it's ubiquitous for people to go out and mow their fields, not just annually, but a lot of times 2 or 3 times a year. And so, well, no, you don't have that structure out there that's going to hold and support those species that we just mentioned in the middle of the field. And so that's why you find them around the edge.
I think a few people were squirming around in their seat when you started bringing up mowing. Along those same lines, I guess, what if we're thinking about turkeys? So, Bronson, if you want to add something, you're welcome to, even though I changed the subject back to turkeys.
I did have one quick thing.
Okay.
I'd like to get Craig's 2 cents on, and maybe I'm indeed thinking of kind of a normal situation in the Deep South where the amount of openings you have is very limited. So, I mean, literally for maybe every couple hundred acres, you got an acre. And then assuming food is limited, would you rather see that person do 1 acre of food plot or manage the opening for naturally occurring vegetation?
That's up to their objectives. If you're wanting to shoot a deer over that opening in November, you might want to plant some crimson clover, some berseem clover, and oats. They're not going to be strongly attracted to warm season forbs that was providing the highest quality nutrition from April through July in November. So that's where there's trade-offs, and there's really nothing these folks can do about that on these large lease holdings if they don't have the ability to manage much of the property. But most of these people are in those leases because they want to shoot something. And so with that in mind, plant something in those openings that's going to be strongly attractive and shoot something. There's nothing wrong with that. We shouldn't apologize about that. Deer need to be shot. There's too many of them in places. And people like to shoot turkeys when they're strutting across a small food plot. I do. Y'all do. I've watched you.
Yeah.
Also, although I've watched Marcus miss one, but then he got it on the wing, when he got out there just a little late.
We don't talk about that one, Craig. Yeah.
But all joking aside, don't be surprised that the deer or the number of turkeys on that property, the quality of the deer, the size of the deer, or the number of the turkeys on that property then is not as great as what you would like it to be, because both of those are what we call generalist species. You'll find them in wide open landscapes or in totally closed canopy forest landscapes. But when you have a good percentage and a nice arrangement of openings in your forested areas as well as brushy areas, etc., then the habitat quality, which means the amount and quality of food, the amount and quality of cover during different times of the year, are increased, and then you can see more robust populations of those species. And so you can have 100 deer per square mile in a pine forest, but I doubt many of them are going to score 150 inches.
So along the same lines of this discussion, what Bronson just asked you, Craig, or I guess this is open to both of you, are there, if you have only a couple % of your land is accessible in openings and it's you don't own the forests, are there food plot prescriptions that you could use to optimize the attraction during deer season, and then maybe some attraction during turkey season, and then poult rearing and fawn fawning areas, or, what, I guess, how do people deal with that, given they only have a small acreage to work with? Are there ways that you could target plantings to accomplish some of each of those?
I'll give you my first quick thought that I've seen work so many times, and we prescribe this a lot, and that is to concentrate some of those small openings in annuals, as I just mentioned. If you have simply crimson clover, for example, which down south is going to flower in, mid to late April, and it's going to be dead long about early May to mid-May for sure. And you also have some wheat or oats in with that, not too much, not more than 30 to 40 pounds PLS per acre. And in particular, if you have an awnless variety of wheat, as we've talked about a lot, then that wheat also dies in May. And then through the summer, you're going to have a variety of, quote, weeds, and especially various forbs coming up from the seed bank. And that then is going to hold a lot more insects. The turkeys and the deer are going to eat the wheat seed heads. The turkeys also eat the oat seed heads if you planted oats instead. And you can have a nice early successional community right there in those small plots. It's going to be attractive to broods, and it's going to have a food source both for broods, adult turkeys, and adult deer. And overall, that's going to be less with regard to maintenance than if you were trying to maintain a perennial plot on that same small acreage.
Yeah, the one thing that and maybe because this is so common for me, is dealing with properties that at least we think are food limited. The deer body size is small, habitat at a really large scale can't be managed. And so we're trying to get as much forage production out of that small acreage on the property as we can throughout the year. Is exactly what Craig recommended, but then also including a later maturing clover that is also going to provide forage on into May, June, July, depending on the weather and the type of clover. But real simply, it's also including an arrowleaf, berseem, or a red clover. So that, and then if they can do warm season plantings too, fantastic, go for it. But more often than not, it's simply going to be getting in there in September, give or take. They're going to do one planting. And so can we provide a window going from October all the way until June with that one cool season planting? So completely agree with Craig. And again, this is from a context of deer and for food limiting. But I would just add that one little tidbit about adding a later maturing clover as well to that mix.
Well, I think that's an interesting point. You mentioned something else that got my mind racing. That's what about a warm season food plot? If you had an annual moving into an annual cool season moving into an annual warm season, would that be more desirable if you're just strictly interested in deer?
Yeah, I'll give you my 2 cents, but again, Marcus, this all comes back to that context. If you only have a few acres or a small percentage of your land, what we really don't want to see is you disking up an actively growing food plot and not have any forage for 6 weeks to 2 months to get that warm season planting going. So what I would rather them do is, if you had 2 or 3 or 4 or 10 plots, is to have some plots that are devoted to warm season. And it works really well if you have that cool season plot with one of these later maturing clovers that's still producing well in May and into June. And then during May, you're at your warm season plot, planting that to a warm season forage. As the cool season plot is diminishing, the warm season plot is taking off. And so You literally are providing as much forage as you can per your limited area year round. That's kind of, if you can game plan it perfect world, that's what we would recommend.
I agree with all of that. The only thing that I might throw in there is that usually these areas are small, and so the deer density on most of these sites is going to be such that you can't get a warm season planting, minus perhaps joint vetch that does pretty well with grazing pressure, to really grow and produce much on those small plots. And so in those examples, we do exactly what Bronson's mentioning. We'll add arrowleaf, balança, especially arrowleaf, which, arrowleaf is good and is producing grazable forage on into at least early July. And the deer literally will be eating the last leaves and the stems off of it through mid to late July. And then, of course, adding red, that can get you on into August. But if you had a number of those, that's when I would encourage having some of those in perennials also, because although it's a perennial cool season planting, the primary production period of those is going to be late March through July, essentially functioning as a warm season food plot. So I would have a combination of annual cool seasons and perennial cool seasons. If I'm limited on a lease and I had a number of, quote, small plots, that's probably what I would concentrate on more than trying to have a warm season planting, because of the restrictions of many of those that they're going to be, grazed out quickly. And you said if deer is the primary consideration, if turkeys is the primary consideration, then I'm going to leave out those clovers that will extend on into the summer. That's why I just limited the mixture earlier to crimson, because it's going to die earlier, because I actually want that germination and growth of the forbs from the seed bank, because of the structure that they provide for those broods, which is really good.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question to you. If you are interested in turkeys, and particularly in making sure there's adequate structure for poult production, it sounds like that's what you would recommend, is to just leave out some of those longer.
But let me also say, I mean, this pains me. It really pains me when I go to properties and this is, the restriction. Well, the timber company, they won't let us do anything. And a lot of them, they don't even thin. I mean, they're having a fair amount of harvest, but the amount of harvesting that they're doing, that is what's driving the wildlife populations on those properties way more than all of these little bitty food plots put together. And so it really hurts when you can't get in there and actively manage, what we'd call the meat of the property, because these food plots, that's just dressing, the gravy, so to speak. The meat and potatoes is managing the forest or managing the woodlands properly for those focal species. And then also, when you're not on leased property and you have an appreciable amount of open land, then managing those fields specifically for deer or turkeys or rabbits or, bobwhite, whatever it is that you're most interested in.
Yeah, it's a good point. So I guess, Bronson, what along those same lines, what is pretty typical on these pine forest areas for the rotation? How much of the acreage is a recent clear cut where they may get some of these benefits out of it?
Gosh, I wish I could generalize. It all depends, and kind of what we're going through now too. What are timber prices? And it's a lot more difficult to move wood and to get thinnings right now. But Gosh, if you're on small acreage, and by small, I guess I'm generalizing and saying you got a couple hundred acres, 300 or 400 acres. I mean, heck, you may go 25 years before you're going to have a clear cut on that property. And I guess, Marcus, that really gets to looking at the landscape, getting on Google Earth and seeing what's around you. A lot of these problems are solved with cover, generating cover, and a lot of good food is,
Mhm.
2 to 3 years post clear cut, you have fantastic cover and you have a lot of food. It's just unfortunate for the leaseholder that is completely out of their hands. That's a silvicultural decision. It's an economic decision, and that's going to happen every couple decades or so.
Yeah. Well, there's one thing that's kind of sticking in my head, and I noticed neither of you have brought it up, but nearly maybe every landowner, but most of them for sure that I go and have visited have a supplemental feeding program to some degree, and neither of you have mentioned that, even though we've talked about food production quite a bit. So I was curious if you had any thoughts on supplemental feeding and the role that would play in this type of landscape.
Happy to give my 2 cents. Can supplemental feeding work? And can supplemental feeding increase deer quality? However you want to measure that, whatever you're interested in. Most people for antlers. You have got to put so much context around a statement like this. Can supplemental feeding improve deer quality? Yes, it can, depending on, is nutrition limited on the property? If nutrition is not limited, meaning the habitat is already managed very well, you're probably not going to see any improvement. The the other part of that, and this is real world dollars and cents, I almost said never, and I'm scared to say never. Rarely, rarely, rarely have I ever been to a place or worked with the landowner, talked with the landowner, where they are supplemental feeding at a scale to which they would improve average diet quality for the deer population at large that's residing some part of the year on their property. And when you think about what you have to do, is that literally feeders at 1 per 100 to 150 acres, fed all of the time, excuse me, unless you have a lot of time and money and resources and people to keep that system going, um, I don't think you're going to get a return on your investment. I think if you were to quantify the amount of time and money that you would put into maximizing food plots, managing the habitat when you can, managing the deer density and the composition of the herd, uh, I think it's apples and oranges of what kind of return on investment you're going to get. But I'm not going to sit here and say that if done correctly and if nutrition is limited, well, of course, supplemental feeding can improve deer quality, but you have to check a lot of boxes before you would see that.
I certainly agree with what Bronson said, and I'll take that a step further. If you're in a landscape where there are openings and sunlight is hitting the ground, and so let's walk away from the closed canopy pine stand where literally, as measured, there is not 10 pounds of deer food per acre. Okay, so let's walk away from that and let's get to a property where there are openings, sunlight is hitting the ground, or trees are thinned to the amount that, maybe you got 50% sunlight or whatever coming in. At that point, if you look at the nutrition that is available in the plants that then are growing, there's no way you could see an effect from supplemental feed, because those plants have the nutrients that deer require in excess of what they are, in excess of the level at which they need them. And so if those plants are available, you shouldn't be surprised that when you put out X number of feeders, well, gosh, if you collected the data, and nobody does really, what was your antler score per age class for the previous 5 years? And so now that you put out your feeders over this past, 3 to 5 years, what is it now? And that's all you've done. On the flip side, if you change this unproductive vegetation to more productive vegetation, undesirable to desirables, grass to the appropriate forbs, a bunch of tree sprouts and whatnot in the woods to more forbs, and of course, sprouts from trees that you've cut, as you've well documented, can be highly nutritious. When you have that's available, the nutrients that are in those plants, it's off the charts. You're talking about crude protein levels that easily are above 20. Many of them are above 30. Phosphorus levels that are 0.3 to 0.6. Calcium levels that are way above 1%. And at no time does deer need above about 0.5%, even a doe with lactating with fawns. And so having the sunlight on the ground and managing that appropriately then precludes you from needing or seeing an effect of feeding. And I have worked with so many landowners who have done that and collected data then after they stopped feeding and started managing their woods or fields appropriately. And it's like Shazam. All of a sudden they see a 10-point increase in antler size per age class. They see doe weights go from 100, 110 pounds to 130, 140. And I'm talking about average per, adult does, whereas you might have some that even are at this latitude, and I'm not talking about Iowa, that are, 170 pounds. And so that's outstanding. And that's all easily accomplished without the use of feeders.
So we focused a lot on deer with that. What about the supplemental feeding for turkeys? I know a lot of people do that. Are you reaping any benefit there?
Well, if you're doing so and it's during the hunting season, you're probably doing so illegally. Not that anybody ever would put out a corn pile in April. I'm gonna tell you what, I challenge you to open a gobbler's crop in April, early May, obviously during the hunting season, and see how many don't have corn in it. It's unbelievable. I mean, property to property to property, these people don't put out corn, but every gobbler that's killed has corn in the crop. And so I think it is staggering at the amount of feed that is being placed on the ground, whether we're talking about turkey season or during the deer season. And something that's beginning to get a lot of attention and needs a lot more attention is the sublethal effects of some of these toxins, and including viruses that are tied to these bait piles and feeding stations that may be causing reduced reproductive output in turkeys, whether it be reduced numbers of eggs in the clutch, reduced hatchability, etc. But, a lot of places have recorded reduced fecundity rates, and that's reduced number of birds that are ultimately, brought into the fall population, your nest success, your poult survival, etc. And so there is ample evidence that suggests there are increased and elevated amounts of toxins and whether it be fungus, viruses, etc., that are in these bait piles that could be causing problems, not just to quote, kill the turkey or other animals, but to have a suppressive effect on the reproductive output. And, that's not my specialty, but I've certainly been reading a fair amount of information on that. And I think it's of great interest
We just
and should get a lot more
published an
attention.
article in the Quality Whitetails. We just student finished that up about a month ago, and won't go into all the specifics of it, but bottom line was that we were surprised the level of aflatoxin in the fall and winter was as low as it was. So literally kind of going into it, thought we would see a lot more greater aflatoxin level in quote deer corn and in the feeders and on the ground in the fall and winter during deer hunting season. So we were surprised it was that low. Equally surprised how high it was during the spring. So when you take that same corn with a very low aflatoxin level and put that on the ground, which during the springtime is the perfect recipe for growing a fungus, is because now we have warmer temperatures, we have humid environment, moisture, etc. That I don't remember the numbers, but it was above lethal dose for turkeys at the end of like 5 days. And so and again, like you said, Craig, there's a lot of reasons wildlife die, including turkeys and quail, et cetera, et cetera. But we thought it was very compelling, especially if using corn in the springtime and summer, that we found definitely a smoking gun for a mechanism of where we could have toxicity in turkeys.
Well, it sounds like there's a good reason you guys didn't mention supplemental feeding when we were going through all that.
Well, we could chase that rabbit for a long time, but that's not necessarily helping folks who can't use fire. And maybe we'd concentrate more on the chainsaw, the disc, the
Absolutely.
sprayer, etc. So.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, it sounds like the amount of money that goes into a supplemental feeding program might be better saved so that you can buy some land so that you can manipulate all these other things.
I'm reminded on our podcast, Marcus, on Deer University a couple years ago, and I may be wrong here, but it's about the only study I'm aware of that looked so specifically at the effects of supplemental feed. And this was in South Texas. They did it at a scale that most people can't. And so literally you're doing something here at a scale of, 20,000+ acres. You're talking about a feeder every 150 acres at that type of scale. You have a team of people keeping those feeders full year round. And then it takes 5 to 10 years before you start seeing an effect. And they did indeed. And they even marked the feed with an isotope where they could take a tissue sample from the deer, randomly sampled in that area, and they could estimate what proportion of their diet came from the feed versus came from the range. And they did. They documented about a 10-inch increase in Boone and Crockett score on mature bucks. Now, when I asked the manager, the leader of that, but do you recommend doing this? I remember he said it very jokingly, and it was a great soundbite. He says, "It doesn't rain down here. If I was in your neck of the woods and it rained, no, I would not do this. This is something we choose to do. I'm not going to say you have to do. We choose to do to kind of normalize the boom and the bust of vegetation, because out of every 5 years, you might have 2 to 3 that are in drought conditions and you're not producing forbs. So that is a management action they employ to kind of normalize some nutrition on the landscape. But even after seeing that, that he experienced, documented that amount of increase, he turned right around and said, if it rained where I manage deer, I wouldn't do this.
That boom and bust of rain down there is pretty
Yeah.
similar to what we have with acorns up here. Now, what do we do to normalize that? We cut more trees to put some more sunlight in there, and then there's no effect from the acorns. Whoop-de-doo.
Good point. Good point.
A periodic bonus. Enjoy them while you have them to hunt around, and don't worry about it. Allow those crowns to expand and enjoy 65% greater acorn production just by releasing those trees that are the producers. There you go.
There you go.
And that's without fire. That's just a chainsaw and a squirt bottle, or just a chainsaw.
Yeah. Yeah, good stuff. Well, I appreciate both of you coming on the show, and I wanted to give you a minute to add anything that you think we may not have covered, and also to let people know about where to find you and some of the resources you have available.
I'm at the University of Tennessee, and we have all kinds of extension publications as well as research publications that are available. All of that's available on my webpage. And I guess the only thing that I would say if you can't use fire is don't worry about it. There's lots of things that you can do to manage your property effectively for your objectives that you can reach without fire. But also, don't close your mind to that if you're one that is not using fire because you're tentative to do so. Try to get outside, your comfort zone a little bit. And what I've told people is, if you, for example, go into the woods and just scratch out like a 30 by 30 foot area with a rake or a blower, start small and burn a small area and get a little bit of experience. And of course, have someone with you who has some experience with fire, and continue to read and talk with others who have used fire. Attend a prescribed fire council meeting in your state or some other workshop that is, teaching prescribed fire management, and put another tool in your toolbox. You don't have to start big, and, never do you have to burn 50 acres. For the vast majority of people, if they're able to burn, 2 to 10 acres at the time, they're going to be really, really pleased with the results.
I would add, in Mississippi, don't neglect the advice that you can get from the Mississippi Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks and their private lands program. John Gruchy loves going out and giving advice on habitat management. Both of y'all know John, don't you?
I don't know.
Are you going to give John? Are you going to give John's cell number here on the podcast?
We'll put it in the show notes.
And his home address, exactly. But we've got whether it be from a deer management perspective, the DMAP program, but they have a great private lands program. So don't neglect those opportunities that are available for you in that regard. In terms of what we have going on, same as Craig mentioned, go to our website, msudeerlab.com, and there's extension publications, research publications are there to read more. And then, of course, just like this podcast, Fire University, check out the Deer University podcast for this type of deer management information. Tune in.
All right. Well, good stuff. Well, we will put some of these links to help direct people to some of those resources in the show notes. But again, guys, really appreciate both of you taking the time. Really great conversation and informative, and I appreciate it.
Always fun to talk to you.
Happy to help, Marcus, anytime.
All right. Till next time. Fire University is part of the Natural Resource University podcast network, funded by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. If you like what you heard today in this episode, please follow us on all the social media platforms at UF Deer Lab.